Kate Morrison adjusted her aviator sunglasses and walked across the tarmac at Riverside Municipal Airport. The morning sun cast long shadows from the small aircraft lined up like sleeping birds. She carried her flight bag with practiced ease, the leather worn smooth from countless hours in cockpits around the world. At 28, Kate had already logged over 3,000 flight hours as a commercial pilot, but today she was here for something different. The Experimental Aircraft Association's monthly breakfast fly-in drew aviation enthusiasts from across 3 states. Kate loved these gatherings where pilots shared stories, compared notes on aircraft modifications, and debated the finer points of aerodynamics over coffee and pancakes. The atmosphere buzzed with the kind of energy that only came from people who truly understood the magic of flight. She spotted the registration table set up near the main hangar. Volunteers in bright orange vests directed traffic, while others arranged folding chairs around several vintage aircraft on display. A pristine 1943 North American P-51 Mustang sat prominently in the center, its polished aluminum skin gleaming like liquid mercury. Kate had seen plenty of warbirds before, but this one looked different somehow. Every rivet, every panel line, every component appeared to be exactly where it belonged. "Beautiful machine, isn't she?" Kate turned to find an elderly man standing beside her. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone well into his 90s, but his eyes held a sharpness that immediately commanded attention. Despite his age, he stood straight and tall, wearing a crisp white shirt and a navy blue blazer adorned with various military pins and patches. "She certainly is," Kate replied, extending her hand. "Kate Morrison, I'm a pilot with Regional Airways." "George Patterson," he said, shaking her hand with a firm grip. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Morrison. That particular Mustang there is actually mine." Kate's eyebrows rose. She looked again at the aircraft, then back at George. "You own that P-51. "For the past 15 years, George confirmed with a gentle smile. "Bought her from an estate sale in Texas. Spent most of those years getting her back to flying condition. She's been worth every hour and every dollar." They walked closer to the aircraft, and Kate noticed details she had missed from a distance. The paint scheme was authentic World War II olive drab and neutral gray, with invasion stripes on the wings and fuselage. The nose art depicted a pin-up girl with flowing auburn hair, and below it the name Rosie's Revenge was painted in elegant script. "The original nose art?" Kate asked. "Recreated from photographs," George explained. "This aircraft served with the 357th Fighter Group in England, shot down 12 German aircraft before the war ended. The original pilot named her after his sweetheart back home in Michigan." Kate walked around the aircraft, admiring the craftsmanship. Every surface looked perfect, from the propeller spinner to the tail wheel. The cockpit canopy was open, revealing an interior that appeared both authentic and immaculately maintained. "Would you like to take a look inside?" George offered. "Are you sure?" Kate hesitated. She knew how particular aircraft owners could be about their prized possessions. "Absolutely, though I should warn you, climbing into a Mustang isn't quite the same as stepping into a modern airliner." Kate accepted George's steadying hand as she climbed onto the wing and lowered herself into the cockpit. The seat was surprisingly comfortable, though positioned much lower than she expected. The instrument panel spread before her like a mechanical symphony, with dozens of analog gauges, switches, and controls arranged in seemingly random patterns. "The instruments are all original," George said from beside the aircraft. "That's the Merlin engine's manifold pressure gauge there on the left. The one next to it shows oil pressure. Cylinder head temperature is at the top center." Kate studied the layout, trying to make sense of the configuration. In her modern aircraft, everything was digital, clearly labeled, and logically arranged. This cockpit looked like controlled chaos. How did pilots navigate with all this? She wondered aloud. "Practice mostly," George chuckled. "Plus a healthy respect for what could go wrong if you didn't pay attention. These birds didn't forgive mistakes." Kate noticed a small placard mounted below the instrument panel. It was yellowed with age and bore the signature of someone named Lt. Colonel James R. Morrison, 357th FG. "Morrison," she read aloud, then looked at George with surprise. "That's my maiden name." George's expression grew thoughtful. "Your father or grandfather, perhaps?" "My grandfather was James Morrison," Kate said slowly. He died when I was 12, but I remember him talking about flying in the war. My grandmother always said he flew fighters, but she never liked to discuss the details. James Morrison, George repeated, stroking his chin. I knew a Jim Morrison in England. We were stationed at RAF Leston together. He flew with the 357th, and I was with the 363rd Fighter Squadron. Same base, different units. Kate felt a chill run down her spine. You knew my grandfather. If it's the same James Morrison, then yes, I did. We flew escort missions together over Germany. Good pilot, your grandfather, steady hands and nerves of steel. He had a way of staying calm when things got complicated. George studied Kate's face with growing recognition. You have his eyes, you know. Same color, same intensity. Jim always had this look when he was concentrating, like he was solving puzzles in his head. They spent the next hour talking while George showed Kate every detail of the Mustang. He explained how the Merlin engine produced over 1,400 horsepower, how the laminar flow wing design gave the aircraft its incredible speed, and why the P-51 had been so effective as a long-range escort fighter. Your grandfather's squadron specialized in bomber escort, George told her as they examined the aircraft's gun ports. The B-17s and B-24s needed protection all the way to targets deep in Germany. The Mustang was the first fighter that could go the distance and still have enough fuel to fight. Kate listened intently as George described missions over Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich. He spoke with the measured tone of someone who had witnessed history firsthand, but also with the weight of memories that weren't entirely pleasant. Jim saved my life once, George said quietly as they walked around the aircraft's tail section. We were escorting bombers to a synthetic fuel plant outside Leipzig. German fighters jumped us about 50 miles from the target. I took a hit in my coolant system and was losing altitude fast. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. Jim stayed with me even though he should have continued with the formation. He flew cover while I nursed my damaged bird back toward friendly territory. We barely made it to an emergency field in Belgium, but we made it. If he hadn't stayed with me, the German fighters would have finished me off for sure. Kate felt a surge of pride hearing about her grandfather's courage, but also sadness that she had never known these stories while he was alive. Why didn't he ever talk about the war? She asked. George considered the question carefully. A lot of us didn't, especially right after we came home. People wanted to put the war behind them and get on with their lives. Plus, some things are hard to explain to folks who weren't there. They continued talking as the breakfast crowd began to gather around the various aircraft displays. Kate found herself drawn into George's stories about life on an English airbase, the camaraderie among pilots, and the technical challenges of maintaining complex aircraft under wartime conditions. Your grandfather understood these machines in ways that went beyond just flying them, George explained. He could listen to an engine and tell you exactly what was wrong. He knew how to squeeze every bit of performance out of an aircraft without breaking it. That kind of understanding kept him alive through 53 combat missions. Kate absorbed every word, building a picture of her grandfather that was far more complete than anything her family had ever shared. George painted a portrait of a skilled, courageous young man who had excelled in one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. Did he ever talk about what he planned to do after the war? Kate asked. He wanted to fly commercially, George replied. Said he'd had enough of fighting, but he never wanted to stop flying. He talked about seeing the world from airline cockpits instead of through gun sights. Kate smiled. He did exactly that, flew for United Airlines for 30 years after the war. My grandmother said he accumulated over 20,000 flight hours before he retired. That sounds like Jim, George nodded approvingly. Always said he'd rather wear out than rust out. As the morning progressed, more visitors gathered around the P-51, drawn by its impressive presence and George's obvious expertise. Kate watched as he patiently answered questions about the aircraft specifications, its wartime service, and the restoration process. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, covering everything from engine timing to ammunition loads to combat tactics. George understands aircraft far better than I ever could, Kate commented to another pilot who had joined their conversation. George overheard and shook his head with a modest smile. Nonsense. Understanding comes from experience, and experience comes from time. You're still building your experience base. But Kate was beginning to realize that George's understanding went far deeper than just accumulated hours. He seemed to grasp the essential nature of how aircraft worked, not just the mechanical details, but the broader principles that made flight possible. As the crowd around the Mustang grew larger, George suggested they move their conversation to a quieter spot near one of the hangars. They found seats on a bench in the shade, where they could continue talking without interruption. "Tell me about your flying," George said. "What type of aircraft do you fly for the airlines?" Kate described her work flying regional routes in turboprop aircraft, the challenges of weather flying, and her goal of eventually moving up to major airline jet equipment. George listened attentively, asking technical questions that demonstrated his broad knowledge of aviation. "The fundamentals haven't changed much since your grandfather's time," he observed. "The equipment is far more sophisticated, but good piloting still comes down to understanding your aircraft, respecting the weather, and making sound decisions under pressure." They talked about the evolution of aviation technology, from the mechanical simplicity of World War II fighters to the computer-controlled complexity of modern airliners. George had witnessed the entire transformation, having continued flying after the war and eventually becoming an airline pilot himself. "I flew for TWA for 32 years, he revealed. "Started on Constellations, ended up on 747s, saw the industry change from stick and rudder flying to systems management. Both approaches have their place." Kate was impressed by the parallels between George's career and her grandfather's. Both had transitioned from military to civilian flying, both had spent decades in airline cockpits, and both had witnessed aviation's remarkable technological evolution. "Did you keep in touch with my grandfather after the war?" she asked. "For a while," George replied. "We exchanged letters for the first few years, but then life got busy. Work, family, all the usual things. I always meant to look him up, but somehow never found the time." There was a note of regret in his voice that Kate found touching. She could imagine how wartime friendships might fade under the pressure of post-war responsibilities, even when the bonds had been forged under life-and-death circumstances. "I'm glad we met today," she said sincerely. "Learning about grandfather from someone who actually knew him means more than I can express." George's weathered face brightened. "The feeling is mutual. Meeting Jim's granddaughter and discovering she's following in his footsteps, well, that's something I never expected when I woke up this morning." As they prepared to rejoin the breakfast gathering, Kate felt like she had gained something precious. The stories George had shared filled gaps in her family history that she hadn't even realized existed. More than that, they helped her understand where her own love of flying had come from. "Would you like to come see the P-51 fly?" George asked as they stood up from the bench. "I'm planning to take her up for a demonstration flight around noon." Kate's eyes widened. "You still fly her yourself?" "Every chance I get," George replied with a grin that took 20 years off his apparent age. "I figured Jim would approve of keeping his squadron mate's aircraft in the air where she belongs." Kate watched with fascination as George began his pre-flight inspection of the P-51. Despite his age, he moved around the aircraft with the confidence of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times. His hands traced along control surfaces, checked fluid levels, and tested mechanical linkages with the thoroughness of a much younger pilot. "Pre-flight on a warbird is different from your modern aircraft," George explained as Kate followed him around the Mustang. "Everything here is mechanical, no computer systems to tell you what's wrong. You have to use your eyes, ears, and hands to make sure everything is as it should be." He showed her how to check the oil level in the massive Merlin engine, pointing out the minimum and maximum marks on the dipstick. The engine compartment was a maze of pipes, wires, and mechanical components that seemed impossibly complex compared to the streamlined turbine engines Kate was accustomed to. 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, supercharged, George recited as he examined various components. "When everything is working properly, it's one of the most reliable engines ever built. When something goes wrong, however, it usually goes wrong quickly." Kate noticed how methodical George was in his inspection. He didn't rush or skip steps, even though he had probably performed this same routine hundreds of times. Every item on his mental checklist received full attention. "Your grandfather taught me that," George said, noticing her observation. He used to say that the aircraft doesn't care how many hours you have or how experienced you think you are. It only cares whether you do things right or wrong. They checked the propeller blades for nicks and cracks, examined the landing gear for proper extension and hydraulic leaks, and verified that all control surfaces moved freely through their full range of motion. George explained the function of each component as they went, turning the inspection into an impromptu lesson on World War II aviation technology. "The beautiful thing about these old birds is that you can see how everything works," he said, demonstrating how the aileron control cables ran from the stick through pulleys to the wing surfaces. No black boxes or computer modules, just mechanical connections you can trace with your eyes. As they completed the external inspection, other pilots and aviation enthusiasts began gathering around the aircraft. Word had spread that George was planning a demonstration flight, and people were curious to see the 93-year-old pilot in action. "Are you sure you're comfortable with all these people watching?" Kate asked quietly. George chuckled. "At my age, every flight might be my last one. If people want to watch, I'm happy to put on a show for them." He climbed onto the wing with surprising agility and lowered himself into the cockpit. Kate positioned herself where she could observe his startup procedure while staying clear of the propeller arc. George's movements inside the cockpit were economical and precise, each action flowing naturally into the next. "Clear prop," George called out loudly before engaging the starter. The Merlin engine turned over slowly at first, then caught with a deep rumble that Kate felt in her chest. Blue-gray exhaust smoke puffed from the engine stacks as the 12 cylinders came to life. The sound was unlike anything from modern aviation, a mechanical symphony that spoke of raw power and engineering excellence. George allowed the engine to warm up while he completed his cockpit checks. Kate could see him methodically working through instrument readings, control movements, and system verifications. Even from outside the aircraft, she could tell that every action was deliberate and purposeful. After several minutes, George advanced the throttle and began his taxi to the active runway. The Mustang moved with surprising grace despite its powerful engine and narrow landing gear. Kate followed in her car, joining the small convoy of spectators who wanted to watch the takeoff from the best vantage point. At the runway threshold, George performed his engine run-up checks. The Merlin's roar echoed across the airport as he tested the magnetos, propeller controls, and other systems. Satisfied with the results, he contacted the tower for takeoff clearance. Kate found herself holding her breath as the P-51 aligned with the runway centerline. She had seen countless takeoffs during her airline career, but this felt different. The combination of George's age, the aircraft's historical significance, and her newfound connection to both made the moment extraordinarily meaningful. George pushed the throttle forward, and the Mustang surged down the runway with startling acceleration. The tail wheel lifted after just a few hundred feet, and moments later the entire aircraft rotated into a steep climb. The landing gear retracted smoothly as George banked left into the traffic pattern. "Magnificent," whispered an older gentleman standing beside Kate. "Simply magnificent." Kate agreed completely. Watching the P-51 in flight was like witnessing a piece of history come alive. The aircraft moved through the sky with an elegance that modern jets couldn't match, despite all their technological advantages. George flew a standard rectangular pattern around the airport, but even basic maneuvers looked spectacular in the Mustang. The aircraft's lines were perfect from every angle, and the sound of the Merlin engine provided a soundtrack that stirred something deep in anyone who heard it. On his downwind leg, George performed a gentle aileron roll, the aircraft rotating smoothly around its longitudinal axis while maintaining straight and level flight. The maneuver drew appreciative comments from the watching crowd and demonstrated both the pilot's skill and the aircraft's capabilities. "Your grandfather could do that same roll," an elderly woman said, appearing beside Kate. She was small and slightly bent with age, but her eyes were bright with intelligence. "I watched him practice that exact maneuver many times." Kate turned to the woman with surprise. "You knew my grandfather?" "I'm Margaret Patterson," the woman replied with a warm smile. "George's wife, and yes, I knew your grandfather quite well. We all lived in the same married officers' quarters at Leston." Kate's heart skipped a beat. "You were in England during the war." "I was an army nurse," Margaret explained. Stationed at the base hospital. That's where I met George after he was wounded in a mission over Berlin. Your grandfather Jim visited him every day during his recovery. Kate found herself meeting another piece of her grandfather's past, another person who had shared experiences she had never known existed. The morning was becoming a journey through family history she had never expected. Jim was like a brother to George, Margaret continued as they watched the P-51 execute another graceful turn overhead. They were roommates in the officers' quarters and flew together whenever possible. When George was shot down over France in early 1945, Jim volunteered for the search and rescue mission. Kate's eyes widened. George was shot down. Behind enemy lines for 3 days, Margaret confirmed. Jim wouldn't give up looking for him even when the squadron commander ordered the search to be called off. He finally spotted George's signal mirror from his cockpit and guided the rescue helicopter to his location. This was yet another story Kate had never heard, another example of the bond between the two pilots that had clearly transcended ordinary friendship. She began to understand why George had been so moved to meet her. They stayed friends after the war, Margaret continued. We visited your grandparents several times in the 1950s. Your grandmother and I exchanged Christmas cards for many years. I remember when your father was born and later when you were born. Jim was so proud to have a granddaughter. Kate felt tears welling in her eyes. The connections she was discovering seemed almost too remarkable to be coincidental. Meeting George had opened a door to a part of her family's history that had been hidden for decades. Overhead, George was beginning his approach for landing. The P-51 descended in a wide spiral, losing altitude gradually while maintaining flying speed. Kate could see him making constant small adjustments to his flight path, reading the wind and positioning the aircraft for a smooth touchdown. Watch his landing, Margaret suggested. George still lands that airplane like he's carrying wounded passengers, smooth as silk every time. Indeed, the Mustang settled onto the runway with barely a puff of tire smoke. George held the tail wheel up momentarily to demonstrate his control of the aircraft, then lowered it gently to the pavement. The entire sequence looked effortless, though Kate knew it required considerable skill to handle a high-performance tailwheel aircraft so smoothly. As George taxied back toward the display area, the crowd burst into spontaneous applause. Several people cheered, and Kate heard someone shout, "Beautiful flying!" The demonstration had clearly impressed everyone who witnessed it. George shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit with the same careful precision he had shown during his pre-flight inspection. His face was flushed with the satisfaction that comes from a perfectly executed flight, and his eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that only aviators truly understand. "How was it?" Kate asked as he approached. "Perfect," George replied simply. "The airplane flew beautifully, the weather was ideal, and I had the best audience a pilot could ask for." Margaret reached up to kiss her husband's cheek. "Show off," she said with obvious affection. "Guilty as charged," George admitted with a grin. As the crowd began to disperse, Kate found herself reluctant to end the conversation with George and Margaret. The morning had provided her with more insights into her grandfather's life than she had gained in the 26 years since his death. "Would you like to join us for lunch?" Margaret asked, as if reading Kate's thoughts. "We usually eat at the airport restaurant after George flies. We'd love to hear more about your family." Kate accepted gratefully. She called her airline scheduling office to confirm that her afternoon flight assignment hadn't changed, then followed George and Margaret to the small restaurant adjacent to the main terminal building. Over sandwiches and coffee, the conversation flowed easily between past and present. Margaret shared stories about life on an English airbase during wartime, while George filled in technical details about flying operations and aircraft maintenance. Kate contributed her own experiences from modern airline flying, drawing comparisons between wartime and civilian aviation. "Your grandfather would be so proud of your career," Margaret said at one point. "He always said that aviation would continue evolving, but that good pilots would always be in demand." George nodded agreement. Jim understood that flying isn't just about operating machinery. It's about making good decisions under pressure, understanding your limitations, and respecting the environment you're working in. Those qualities don't change regardless of the technology. Kate found herself thinking about her own flying experiences in light of what she was learning about her grandfather. She had always assumed her interest in aviation was simply personal preference, but now she wondered if there might be deeper family influences at work. Did grandfather ever talk about his family continuing in aviation? She asked. He hoped someone would, George replied. He used to say that flying was something that got into a person's blood. Once you truly understood the freedom and responsibility of flight, you couldn't imagine doing anything else. Margaret smiled at the memory. He also said that if any of his descendants became pilots, he hoped they would understand aircraft as completely as possible, not just how to operate them, but how they worked and why they worked. Kate thought about her own approach to flying. She had always been thorough in her aircraft systems knowledge, often studying technical manuals beyond what was required for her position. Other pilots sometimes teased her about being overly detailed in her preparations, but she had always felt that understanding her aircraft completely was simply good practice. I think I understand what he meant, she said. When you really know your aircraft, flying becomes more than just following procedures. It becomes a conversation between pilot and machine. George's eyes lit up with approval. Exactly. That's what separated the exceptional pilots from the merely competent ones during the war. The ones who came home were usually the ones who understood their aircraft most completely. As the afternoon wore on, Kate realized that her chance meeting with George and Margaret had given her far more than just family history. It had provided her with a new perspective on her own flying career and a deeper appreciation for the traditions she was continuing. I have a favor to ask, she said as they prepared to leave the restaurant. Anything, George replied. Would you be willing to tell me more stories about grandfather? Maybe we could stay in touch through email or phone calls. I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of his experiences. George and Margaret exchanged glances, and Kate could see they were both pleased by her request. We'd be delighted, Margaret answered. George loves telling those old stories, and I think sharing them with Jim's granddaughter would mean the world to him. More than that, George added, I think Jim would want you to know these stories. They're part of your heritage as much as mine. As they walked back toward the parking area, Kate felt like the day had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Meeting George had connected her to a part of her family's past she had never known existed, and it had given her new insights into her own identity as a pilot. George, she said as they reached their cars, thank you for sharing your airplane and your memories with me today. This has been extraordinary. Thank you for being interested in an old man's stories, he replied. And Kate, your grandfather would be very proud of the pilot you've become. Kate drove back to her apartment that evening with her mind spinning through everything she had learned. The casual joke she had made about George understanding aircraft better than she could had turned out to be more prophetic than she realized. But more importantly, she had discovered that her love of flying connected her to family history in ways she had never imagined. She made a mental note to call her grandmother that evening. For the first time in years, she had new questions to ask about her grandfather's wartime service. And thanks to George and Margaret, she finally had context that might help her understand the answers. 3 weeks after meeting George at the fly-in, Kate found herself driving toward his home in the suburbs outside Denver. The phone conversation she had with her grandmother the night after the airport encounter had been revelatory, confirming many of George's stories and filling in additional details about her grandfather's wartime service. Her grandmother had been surprised that Kate had met someone who actually knew Jim during the war. She had kept a small box of her late husband's military memorabilia in the attic, items she rarely discussed but had never been able to discard. When Kate expressed interest, her grandmother had immediately offered to send the box. Now Kate was carrying that box to George, hoping he could help her understand the significance of its contents. She had examined everything carefully, but many of the items were mysteries to her. There were military documents, photographs of aircraft and people she didn't recognize, and several medals her grandmother had never fully explained. George's house was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood. The front yard was meticulously maintained, and Kate noticed a small hangar visible behind the house. George had mentioned during their phone conversations that he maintained a workshop where he built scale models of World War II aircraft. Margaret answered the door with a warm smile and ushered Kate into a living room that was like stepping into an aviation museum. The walls were covered with photographs from George's military and airline career, technical drawings of various aircraft, and detailed scale models displayed on custom-built shelves. "George is out in his shop," Margaret explained. "He's been excited about your visit all week. Can I get you some coffee while we wait for him?" Kate accepted gratefully and spent a few minutes examining the photographs and models while Margaret prepared refreshments. Many of the photos showed George in military uniform beside various aircraft, but others captured moments from his airline career. She recognized some of the aircraft types from her own flying experience, though George's photos showed them in earlier configurations. "These models are incredible," Kate said when Margaret returned with coffee. The scale aircraft were museum quality, with every detail perfectly rendered in miniature. "George builds those from scratch," Margaret explained with obvious pride. "He researches the original aircraft specifications, then creates his own drawings and patterns. Each model takes him about 6 months to complete." Kate examined a perfect one, 32 scale, Mustang that was identical to the full-size aircraft she had seen George fly. Every rivet, every panel line, even the nose art had been reproduced with extraordinary accuracy. "Is this based on his airplane?" Kate asked. "That's actually a model of your grandfather's aircraft," Margaret replied. "George found photographs and documentation about Jim's specific P-51 in the National Archives. He built that model as a tribute to their friendship." Kate felt a chill of recognition. Her grandfather's aircraft had been nearly identical to George's current Mustang, painted in the same olive drab and gray camouflage scheme. Seeing it recreated in perfect miniature made the historical connection feel immediate and personal. George appeared from the back of the house, wiping his hands on a shop towel. His face brightened when he saw Kate examining the model aircraft. "I see Margaret is showing off my handiwork," he said with a pleased expression. "This is absolutely beautiful," Kate replied, gesturing toward the P-51 model. "Margaret tells me it's based on my grandfather's airplane." "As accurate as I could make it," George confirmed. "I spent 2 years researching the documentation. Your grandfather's aircraft was assigned serial number 4415574, squadron code E2. She was named Irish Eyes after your grandmother." Kate's breath caught. Her name was Iris, but everyone called her Irish. "Exactly. Jim painted her name on the nose cowling below the standard pin-up art. Most pilots personalize their aircraft that way." George led Kate to a desk where he had spread out several large photographs and technical documents. "These are some of the materials I used for the model. I thought you might be interested in seeing the official records." The photographs showed Kate's grandfather standing beside his P-51, looking impossibly young in his flight suit and leather jacket. Other photos captured him with his ground crew, performing pre-flight inspections, and sitting in the cockpit preparing for missions. "He looks so serious in these pictures," Kate observed. "Combat flying was serious business," George replied. "But Jim had his lighter moments too. He was actually quite the practical joker when we weren't flying missions." Margaret joined them at the desk, carrying the box Kate had brought from her grandmother. "Let's see what treasures you've brought us," she said with anticipation. Kate opened the box and began removing items one by one. George and Margaret examined each piece with the reverence of people who understood their historical significance. There were military orders, flight logs, mission reports, and several citations for gallantry and achievement. "This is remarkable," George said, studying a leather-bound flight logbook. "Jim kept detailed records of every mission. Look here, this entry from March 15, 1945. That was the day he stayed with me when my aircraft was damaged." Kate looked at the entry George was indicating. Her grandfather's handwriting was precise and economical. "Escort mission to Leipzig. Synthetic oil facilities. Patterson's aircraft hit by flak cooling system damaged. Provided cover during emergency return to Belgium. All aircraft returned safely." "He wrote it like it was routine," Kate observed. "To him, it probably was," George replied. "Jim had this way of making everything look easy even when it wasn't. That's what made him such a good pilot." They continued through the contents of the box, with George providing context for documents and photographs that had been mysteries to Kate's family for decades. Each item sparked stories about specific missions, fellow pilots, or life on the English airbase. Near the bottom of the box, Kate found a small velvet case she hadn't noticed during her earlier examination. Inside was a medal she didn't recognize, along with the official citation that explained its significance. "The Distinguished Flying Cross," George said with obvious respect when Kate handed him the medal. "This is quite an honor. Jim never mentioned receiving this." Margaret read the citation aloud. "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as pilot of a P-51 aircraft during escort missions over heavily defended enemy territory. Captain Morrison's exceptional skill, courage, and devotion to duty resulted in the successful completion of 53 combat missions without loss of aircraft under his command." 53 missions was well beyond the normal tour of duty, George explained. Most pilots were rotated home after 25 missions. Jim volunteered for additional tour because his experience was so valuable to new pilots arriving in the squadron. Kate held the medal carefully, feeling the weight of history in her hands. Why didn't he ever talk about this? "Many veterans didn't discuss their decorations," Margaret said gently. "The men who deserved medals most were often the ones least likely to mention them. They saw themselves as just doing their job." George nodded agreement. Jim was particularly modest about his achievements. He used to say that the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home. As they continued examining the contents of the box, Kate began to understand why her grandfather had been reluctant to discuss his wartime service. The magnitude of what he had accomplished and the risks he had accepted were far greater than her family had ever realized. "There's something else I want to show you," George said, standing up from the desk. He led Kate to another wall display that featured a large framed photograph she hadn't noticed earlier. The photo showed a group of about 20 pilots standing in front of several P-51 Mustangs. They were all young men in flight suits, grinning at the camera with the casual confidence of youth. George pointed to a figure in the front row. "That's your grandfather right there," he said. "And that's me next to him. This was taken just before our last mission of the war in April 1945. Kate studied her grandfather's face in the photograph. He looked confident and capable, but also very young. It was difficult to reconcile this image with the elderly man she remembered from her childhood. "You all look like kids," she said. "We were kids," Margaret replied from across the room. "Most of the pilots were barely 21 years old. George was 22 when this picture was taken." Kate did the math quickly. If George was 22 in 1945, he was now 93 years old. The thought that he was still flying high-performance aircraft at that age was almost beyond comprehension. "George," she said, turning back to him, "what keeps you flying at your age? Aren't you ever concerned about the risks?" George considered the question seriously. "I suppose I could worry about risks, but flying is what I've done my whole life. It's who I am. Giving it up would be like giving up breathing." He gestured toward the photograph on the wall. "Besides, I owe it to these young men to keep their aircraft in the air. Most of them never had the chance to grow old with their airplanes. I feel obligated to carry on for them." Kate understood what he meant. Flying the P-51 wasn't just a hobby for George. It was a way of honoring his fallen comrades and preserving a piece of history that might otherwise be forgotten. "Would you like to see my workshop?" George asked. "I'm currently building a model of a B-17 bomber that your grandfather used to escort." Kate followed George through the back of the house to a converted garage that served as his workshop. The space was immaculately organized, with tools arranged precisely on pegboards and work surfaces cleared of all but essential items. The partially completed B-17 model dominated a central workbench, its intricate internal structure visible through the transparent plastic fuselage. "Flying Fortress," George explained as Kate examined the model. "This particular aircraft was part of the 91st Bomb Group that Jim's squadron frequently escorted. I'm building it to honor the bomber crews who did the really dangerous work." Kate was amazed by the level of detail George was incorporating into the model. Every gun position, every piece of equipment, even the crew members were being recreated in perfect scale. The project clearly represented hundreds of hours of painstaking work. "How do you research all these details?" she asked. "Veterans organizations, military museums, online databases," George replied. "There are also other model builders who share information and photographs. It's become a worldwide community of people dedicated to preserving aviation history." George showed Kate his reference materials for the B-17 project. Technical manuals, historical photographs, even interviews with surviving crew members. The depth of research required for each model was extraordinary. This is as much about historical preservation as model building, Kate realized. Exactly, George confirmed. When I'm gone, these models will remain as accurate representations of the aircraft that these young men flew and fought in. They'll be educational tools for future generations. As they talked, Kate began to understand that George's model building was another expression of the same dedication to accuracy and attention to detail that had made him an exceptional pilot. Whether flying a real aircraft or building a scale replica, he demanded perfection from himself. "I'd like to propose something," Kate said as they returned to the living room where Margaret was carefully repacking Kate's grandfather's memorabilia. "What do you have in mind?" George asked. "I'd like to learn more about these wartime aircraft, not just the history but the technical details. You've shown me that understanding aircraft completely makes you a better pilot, regardless of what type you're flying." George's eyes lit up with interest. "What specifically would you like to know?" "Everything," Kate replied. "How they were designed, how they were maintained, what made them effective. I want to understand them the way my grandfather did." Margaret looked up from the memorabilia box with a knowing smile. "I think we can arrange that," she said. "George loves nothing more than sharing his technical knowledge with interested students." "It would be my pleasure," George added. "We could start with basic aerodynamics and work our way up to specific aircraft systems. I have a complete technical library here at the house." Kate felt a surge of excitement at the prospect. Learning about vintage aircraft from someone with George's experience would be like taking a master class in aviation history and technology. "When can we start?" she asked eagerly. "How about next Saturday?" George suggested. "We could begin with the fundamentals of piston engine operation. After all, you can't really understand these aircraft without understanding their power plants." Kate agreed immediately. As she prepared to leave, she realized that her casual comment about George understanding aircraft better than she could had become the foundation for what promised to be an extraordinary educational experience. "Thank you both for everything today," she said as Margaret handed her the carefully repacked box of memorabilia. "Thank you for bringing these treasures to share," Margaret replied. "Seeing Jim's records and medals brought back wonderful memories for both of us." George walked Kate to her car. Carrying a stack of technical manuals and photographs he was lending her for preliminary study. "Kate," he said as she prepared to drive away, "I want you to know that helping you understand these aircraft means as much to me as it does to you. Teaching young pilots has always been one of my greatest satisfactions." "I promise to be a dedicated student," Kate replied. "I have no doubt about that," George said with conviction. "You have your grandfather's curiosity and attention to detail. Those qualities will serve you well in whatever aircraft you choose to fly." As Kate drove home that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that chance meeting at the airport fly-in. What had started as a casual encounter with an elderly pilot had evolved into a journey of discovery about her family history and a commitment to deepening her understanding of aviation technology. She looked forward to Saturday's lesson with anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. Learning about aircraft engines and systems from George would be educational, but it would also be a way of connecting with her grandfather's legacy in ways she had never imagined possible. That night, she called her grandmother to share some of the stories George and Margaret had told about her grandfather's wartime service. For the first time in years, her grandmother seemed eager to discuss those long-ago days, as if Kate's newfound interest had given her permission to remember. "Your grandfather would be so pleased," her grandmother said near the end of their conversation. "He always hoped someone in the family would carry on his love of flying. I think he'd be especially happy that you're learning from his old friend George." Kate agreed completely. She felt like she was embarking on a journey that would honor her grandfather's memory while advancing her own understanding of the aircraft that had shaped both their lives. Saturday morning found Kate sitting in George's workshop, surrounded by technical manuals, engine components, and detailed cutaway drawings of World War II aircraft powerplants. For the past month, she had been coming to his house every weekend for what had become intensive tutorials in vintage aviation technology. George had proven to be an exceptional teacher, combining decades of hands-on experience with an encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft systems. Today's lesson focused on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered his P-51 Mustang, but the principles they were discussing applied to all high-performance piston engines of the era. The key to understanding these engines is recognizing that they were designed for maximum power output under extreme conditions, George explained as he pointed to a detailed cross-section diagram. Every component had to be both powerful and reliable because engine failure in combat usually meant death. Kate studied the diagram intently, noting how every part seemed to serve multiple functions. The complexity was staggering compared to the turbine engines she was familiar with from her airline flying. "How did mechanics in the field maintain these engines?" she asked. "The number of moving parts seems overwhelming." "Excellent question," George replied, pulling out a wartime maintenance manual. Field maintenance was one of the biggest challenges of the war. Ground crews had to keep these engines running with limited tools, spare parts, and often under combat conditions. He showed Kate photographs from his own wartime experience, images of mechanics working on engines by flashlight, repairing battle damage with improvised tools, and performing major overhauls in freezing English weather. "Your grandfather understood this better than most pilots," George continued. "He spent time with his ground crew, learning how the engine worked and what could go wrong. That knowledge saved his life on several occasions when he had to nurse damaged aircraft back to base." George opened a thick logbook filled with his own wartime maintenance records. "Look at this entry from February 1945, he said, pointing to a handwritten page. "Engine running rough on number 11 cylinder. Ground crew found cracked spark plug insulator. Jim diagnosed the problem by listening to the engine note during run-up." Kate was impressed by her grandfather's ability to identify specific mechanical problems by sound alone. In her modern aircraft, computer systems monitored every engine parameter and provided detailed diagnostic information. The idea of diagnosing problems through human senses seemed almost mystical. "Could you teach me to recognize those sounds?" she asked. George smiled. "Absolutely. In fact, that's going to be our next practical exercise. Margaret and I are planning to fly the Mustang to an airshow in Kansas next weekend. Would you like to come along as an observer? You could listen to the engine throughout the flight and learn to identify normal and abnormal operating characteristics." Kate's heart leaped at the invitation. She had been hopping for an opportunity to fly in the P-51, but hadn't wanted to presume on George's generosity. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I know how particular you are about the aircraft." "I'm particular about safety," George corrected, "but I trust your airmanship completely. Besides, teaching you to understand this engine is exactly what Jim would have wanted." Margaret appeared at the workshop door carrying a tray of sandwiches and lemonade. "Are you two talking about the Kansas trip?" she asked. "George just invited me to come along as an observer," Kate replied. "Wonderful," Margaret said with obvious pleasure. "It's about time that airplane carried a member of Jim's family again." As they ate lunch, George outlined the flight plan for the Kansas trip. The airshow was being held at a former World War II training base that had been restored as a living history museum. Several other warbirds would be participating, including B-17 and B-24 bombers that represented the types of aircraft Kate's grandfather had escorted during the war. "It'll be like stepping back in time," Margaret explained. "They've recreated the entire atmosphere of a wartime airbase, complete with period vehicles, uniforms, and equipment." George pulled out charts and began explaining the route they would follow. Unlike modern airline flying with its precise GPS navigation and constant air traffic control guidance, flying the P-51 to Kansas would require traditional pilotage techniques. "We'll navigate primarily by visual reference to ground landmarks," George explained, tracing their proposed route on a sectional chart. "Dead reckoning navigation, just like your grandfather used over Europe." Kate studied the chart, noting how different this type of flying would be from her airline experience. Instead of following predetermined routes between radio navigation aids, they would be reading the landscape below and making constant adjustments for wind and weather. "What about weather?" she asked, examining the forecast George had obtained. "Clear skies and light winds," George replied. "Perfect conditions for this type of flying. We'll be able to maintain visual contact with the ground throughout the entire flight." Margaret began explaining the logistics of the trip. They would depart early Friday morning, arrive in Kansas in time for the afternoon practice session, participate in the air show on Saturday, and return home Sunday evening. George always flies conservatively on these trips, Margaret said. He plans extra fuel stops, monitors weather constantly, and never pushes the aircraft beyond reasonable limits. Kate appreciated George's cautious approach. Despite his obvious skill and experience, he treated every flight with the respect that high-performance aircraft demanded. "I'll need to arrange time off from the airline," Kate said, already planning how to adjust her schedule. "Take all the time you need," George replied. "This will be an educational experience you'll remember for the rest of your flying career." Over the next few days, Kate threw herself into preparation for the Kansas trip. She studied P-51 operating procedures, reviewed the planned route, and researched the historical significance of their destination airfield. George had provided her with a comprehensive reading list that covered everything from engine operation to wartime navigation techniques. The night before their departure, George called to review final details and confirm weather conditions. The forecast remained favorable, with clear skies and calm winds predicted throughout their route. "Meet us at the airport at 6:30, George instructed. "We'll complete a thorough pre-flight inspection and depart as soon as the sun is fully up." Kate arrived at the airport early, eager to begin what promised to be an extraordinary adventure. The P-51 sat on the ramp looking magnificent in the morning light, its polished surfaces reflecting the rising sun like liquid metal. George and Margaret were already there, loading overnight bags and flight equipment into the aircraft's small baggage compartment. George moved around the airplane with his usual methodical precision, checking every component with the thoroughness Kate had come to expect. "Ready for your first ride in a warbird?" Margaret asked with a knowing smile. "More than ready," Kate replied, though she felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. George helped Kate into the rear cockpit, explaining the basic layout of instruments and controls. The rear seat of the P-51 had limited visibility and fewer instruments than the front cockpit, but it would give Kate an excellent platform for observing George's flying techniques and listening to the engine. "Your primary job today is to pay attention," George said as he climbed into the front cockpit. "Watch how I manage the engine throughout the flight. Listen to the sound changes during different phases of operation. This is going to be a master class in piston engine management." Margaret positioned herself near the propeller to act as ground guide for the engine start. George methodically worked through his pre-start checklist while Kate familiarized herself with the rear cockpit layout. "Clear prop," George called before engaging the starter. The Merlin engine came to life with its distinctive rumble, and Kate felt the vibration through the aircraft's structure. From the rear cockpit, she had an excellent view of the exhaust stacks and could observe the blue-tinted flames that indicated proper fuel mixture. "Listen to the engine note," George said through the intercom as he completed his warm-up checks. "Smooth and steady. Any irregularity in that sound would indicate a potential problem." George taxied to the active runway with the careful precision Kate had observed during his previous flights. The Mustang's narrow landing gear and powerful engine required constant attention during ground operations, but George made it look effortless. At the runway threshold, George performed his engine run-up checks while explaining each procedure to Kate through the intercom. He tested the magnetos, checked propeller operation, and verified that all engine parameters were within normal limits. "Riverside Tower, Mustang 279er ready for departure," George called. "Mustang 279er, cleared for takeoff runway 27, fly heading 270, contact departure on 124.3. George acknowledged the clearance and aligned the aircraft with the runway centerline. "Here we go," he announced, pushing the throttle forward to takeoff power. The acceleration was unlike anything Kate had experienced in her airline career. The Mustang surged forward with tremendous force, pinning her back in the seat as George controlled the aircraft with subtle stick and rudder inputs. Within seconds, they were airborne and climbing steeply away from the airport. Kate watched the landscape fall away below them as George retracted the landing gear and reduced power to climb settings. The view from the P-51's bubble canopy was spectacular, offering nearly unlimited visibility in all directions. Notice how the engine sound changes with power adjustments, George said, demonstrating various power settings as they climbed to cruising altitude. Each setting has its own distinctive note. Experienced pilots learn to set power by ear as much as by instruments. For the next hour, George flew the Mustang across the Colorado countryside while providing Kate with a running commentary on engine management, navigation techniques, and the historical significance of various landmarks below. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, covering everything from wartime training bases to the aerodynamic principles that made the P-51 such an effective aircraft. "There's Lowry Air Force Base," George pointed out as they passed south of Denver. "That's where your grandfather received his initial flight training before shipping overseas. The base is closed now, but it played a crucial role in training thousands of military pilots." Kate studied the abandoned airfield below, imagining her grandfather as a young cadet learning the fundamentals of military flying. The connection between past and present felt immediate and powerful from the cockpit of the Mustang. As they continued eastward across Kansas, George demonstrated various aspects of the P-51's performance. He showed Kate how the aircraft handled at different speeds and configurations, explained the relationship between manifold pressure and RPM settings, and illustrated the importance of proper fuel mixture management for maximum efficiency. "The beautiful thing about this airplane is its responsiveness," George explained as he executed a gentle turn around a cumulus cloud. "Every control input produces an immediate and predictable response. The aircraft becomes an extension of the pilot's own senses." Kate could feel what he meant through the aircraft's structure. Unlike modern fly-by-wire aircraft where computer systems interpreted pilot inputs, the P-51 provided direct mechanical connection between pilot and control surfaces. Every air current, every power change, every adjustment was transmitted directly to the pilot through stick and rudder. "This is how my grandfather learned to fly," Kate realized. "Exactly," George confirmed. "Direct feedback, immediate consequences, and complete responsibility for the aircraft's performance. It created pilots who understood flight at a fundamental level." As they approached their destination in central Kansas, George began explaining the approach and landing procedures for the vintage airfield. Unlike modern airports with electronic landing aids and precise approach paths, landing at the Kansas airfield would require traditional visual flying techniques. "Watch how I manage the approach," George instructed as he reduced power and began descending toward the grass runway. "No electronic guidance, just visual references and pilot judgment." Kate observed intently as George flew a textbook approach, adjusting power and attitude constantly to maintain a stable descent path. The landing was as smooth as silk, with barely a puff of dust from the grass runway. As they taxied toward the vintage hangars that served as the airshow's staging area, Kate felt like she had completed far more than just a cross-country flight. She had experienced aviation history from the cockpit of an authentic wartime aircraft, learned fundamental principles of piston engine operation, and gained new appreciation for the skills her grandfather had developed during his own military service. "How was your first warbird flight?" Margaret asked as Kate climbed down from the rear cockpit. "Incredible," Kate replied without hesitation. "I feel like I understand aircraft systems in a completely different way now." George smiled with satisfaction as he completed his post-flight inspection. "That's exactly what your grandfather would have said after his first flight in a high-performance aircraft. Understanding comes through experience, and experience comes through paying attention." As they walked toward the airshow registration area, Kate realized that her comment about George understanding aircraft better than she could had led to the most educational flying experience of her career. But more than that, it had connected her to family history and aviation traditions she was only beginning to appreciate. The weekend promised to be filled with additional learning opportunities, surrounded by other wartime aircraft and pilots who shared George's passion for preserving aviation history. Kate looked forward to every moment of it. The Kansas Airshow exceeded every expectation Kate had formed during the flight from Colorado. The restored World War II airbase buzzed with activity as vintage aircraft arrived throughout Friday afternoon and Saturday morning. By noon on Saturday, the flight line displayed an impressive collection of warbirds including several P-51 Mustangs, a P-47 Thunderbolt, two B-17 Flying Fortresses, a B-24 Liberator, and even a rare P-38 Lightning. Kate spent Saturday morning walking the flight line with George, who seemed to know the history of every aircraft and the story of every pilot. His encyclopedic knowledge transformed each airplane from a static display into a living piece of history with its own unique wartime service record. "That B-17 over there served with the 91st Bomb Group," George explained as they approached the massive four-engine bomber. "Same unit your grandfather used to escort on missions over Germany. She completed 32 combat missions before being transferred to training duties." Kate studied the flying fortress with new appreciation, imagining her grandfather flying protective cover for this exact aircraft during dangerous missions deep into enemy territory. The bomber's size was impressive, but she could also see evidence of the vulnerabilities that had made escort fighters so essential. "The bomber crews were incredibly brave," George continued. "They flew straight and level toward heavily defended targets, knowing they would face fighters and anti-aircraft fire throughout the mission. Fighter pilots like your grandfather had the luxury of maneuverability. Bomber crews just had to endure whatever the enemy threw at them." A distinguished elderly gentleman approached them as they examined the B-17's gun positions. He wore a military flight jacket adorned with squadron patches and moved with the careful dignity of advanced age. "George Patterson," the man called out with obvious pleasure. "I should have known you'd be here with that beautiful Mustang of yours." George turned with a broad smile. "Frank Morrison, you old devil, I was hoping you'd make it this year." Kate's attention snapped to full focus at the mention of the surname Morrison. The elderly gentleman noticed her reaction immediately. "Frank Morrison," the man said, extending his hand to Kate. "And you must be related to someone with aviation connections, judging by your reaction to my name." "Kate Morrison," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "My grandfather was James Morrison. He flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group during the war." Frank's eyes widened with amazement. "Jim Morrison was your grandfather? Well, I'll be damned. Jim Morrison saved my life over Berlin in March 1945. George looked equally surprised by this revelation. "Frank, you never told me you knew Jim Morrison." "Different squadrons, different timing," Frank explained. "I was with the 352nd Fighter Group based at Bodney. We flew a joint mission with the 357th on March 6, 1945. I took flak damage over the target and was losing fuel fast. Jim escorted me all the way back to England, even though it meant using fuel he might have needed for his own emergency." Kate felt the familiar chill of discovery that had become associated with learning new details about her grandfather's wartime service. Every encounter at the airshow seemed to reveal another story, another connection to her family's history. "I've been looking for a way to thank him for 60 years, Frank continued. "Never could track him down after the war. Where is he now?" "He passed away 16 years ago," Kate said gently. "But I know he would have been honored to see you again." Frank's expression softened with the kind of sadness that comes from missed opportunities and the passage of time. "I'm sorry to hear that. Jim was one of the finest pilots I ever knew. Natural stick-and-rudder skills, but more importantly, he had the judgment and courage that kept people alive." George placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Jim's granddaughter has been learning about wartime aviation from me. She's following in his footsteps as a professional pilot." "Airlines or military?" Frank asked with renewed interest. "Regional airlines currently," Kate replied. "I'm working toward a position with a major carrier." "Jim would be proud," Frank said with conviction. "He always said aviation would continue evolving, but that good pilots would always be needed regardless of the technology." As they continued their conversation, other veteran pilots began gathering around them. Word spread quickly that Kate was the granddaughter of James Morrison, a name that apparently carried considerable respect among the World War II aviation community. An elderly man with a weathered face and alert blue eyes introduced himself as Robert Chen, a former B-17 pilot who had flown missions escorted by Kate's grandfather's squadron. "I remember Captain Morrison specifically," Robert said. "He had this way of positioning his flight that made us bomber crews feel completely protected. Some escort pilots would fly their own tactical patterns, but Jim seemed to understand exactly where we needed fighter cover most." Another veteran, Patricia Williams, had served as a ground controller at RAF Leston during the war. She remembered Kate's grandfather from the operations perspective, coordinating his flights and monitoring mission progress from the base communications center. Captain Morrison was meticulous about his flight plans, Patricia recalled. He always filed detailed alternate routes and emergency procedures. When other pilots ran into trouble, Jim was usually the one who knew exactly where to find them. As these conversations continued throughout the day, Kate began to understand that her grandfather had been much more than just another fighter pilot. The consistent themes in every story were his technical competence, tactical wisdom, and unwavering reliability in emergency situations. "George," she said during a quiet moment as they watched the afternoon air demonstrations, "these stories are painting a picture of my grandfather that's quite different from the modest man my family knew." "War heroes often made the most modest peacetime citizens," George replied thoughtfully. "The qualities that made Jim exceptional in combat were exactly the qualities that made him reluctant to discuss his experiences afterward." The afternoon air show provided Kate with her first opportunity to see multiple vintage aircraft performing together. George flew his P-51 in a formation with 3 other Mustangs, demonstrating the type of coordinated flying that had been essential for effective combat operations. From her position near the flight line, Kate could observe the precision required to maintain close formation while executing complex maneuvers. The pilots made it look effortless, but she knew from her own flying experience that maintaining position required constant attention and extremely fine control inputs. "Your grandfather was known for his formation flying skills," Frank Morrison said, appearing beside Kate as they watched the demonstration. "He could hold position in any weather, day or night. That reliability made him a favorite flight leader among younger pilots." During the break between flying demonstrations, George invited Kate to join him for a brief flight in the P-51. This would be her first opportunity to actually manipulate the controls of the warbird, rather than simply observing from the rear cockpit. "We'll start with basic handling characteristics," George explained as they walked toward the aircraft. "I'll let you fly straight and level, make some gentle turns, and get a feel for how the airplane responds." Kate felt a surge of nervous excitement as she climbed into the rear cockpit. This represented a significant step forward in her understanding of vintage aircraft and a direct connection to her grandfather's wartime experiences. George started the engine and completed his pre-flight checks while explaining each procedure through the intercom. The Merlin's familiar rumble provided a backdrop to his patient instruction as they taxied to the active runway. "Remember everything we've discussed about engine management," George said as they aligned with the runway for takeoff. "Watch the manifold pressure and RPM settings throughout the flight." The takeoff felt familiar after her experience during the flight from Colorado, but knowing she would soon be controlling the aircraft added an element of anticipation that made every sensation more intense. Once they reached cruising altitude, George transferred control to Kate. "Your airplane," he announced. "Maintain heading 270, altitude 4,000 feet." Kate took the stick and rudder pedals with the respect these controls deserved. The P-51 responded immediately to her inputs, much more directly than the modern aircraft she was accustomed to flying. Every slight movement produced an immediate reaction from the airplane. "Notice how the aircraft talks to you through the controls," George said as Kate made small adjustments to maintain straight and level flight. "You can feel the air currents, sense the engine's rhythm, and detect changes in the aircraft's balance through your hands and feet." Kate concentrated on maintaining steady flight while absorbing the wealth of sensory information flowing through the aircraft's mechanical control system. This was flying in its purest form, without computer assistance or electronic intervention. "Try a gentle turn to the left," George instructed. "Feel how the aircraft wants to move and work with it rather than fighting it." Kate applied left aileron and rudder pressure, and the Mustang responded with a smooth, coordinated turn. The sensation was remarkably different from modern fly-by-wire aircraft, where computer systems interpreted pilot inputs and managed control surface movements automatically. "Beautiful," George commented. "You're working with the airplane instead of forcing it. That's exactly how your grandfather approached flying." For the next 20 minutes, Kate explored the P-51's handling characteristics under George's patient guidance. She practiced turns, climbs, descents, and power changes while learning to interpret the aircraft's responses and anticipate its behavior. "This airplane wants to fly," Kate observed as she completed a series of gentle S-turns. "It feels alive in a way that modern aircraft don't." "That's the difference between mechanical and electronic flying," George explained. "These old birds provide direct feedback about every aspect of their performance. Modern aircraft are more forgiving, but they also filter out much of the information that helps pilots understand what their airplane is actually doing." As they prepared to return to the airfield, George resumed control for the approach and landing. Kate watched his technique carefully, noting how he constantly adjusted power and attitude to maintain a stabilized approach path. "Landing these aircraft requires more active pilot involvement than modern airliners," George explained as he configured the airplane for landing. "No electronic aids, no autopilot, just pilot skill and judgment." The landing was smooth and precise, demonstrating the level of proficiency George had developed through decades of flying high-performance aircraft. As they taxied back to the parking area, Kate reflected on how much her understanding of aviation had expanded since that first meeting at the Colorado fly-in. That evening, the airshow participants gathered for a banquet that combined good food with remarkable storytelling. Kate found herself seated at a table with several World War II veterans who had known her grandfather or flown with his squadron. The stories that emerged during dinner painted an increasingly complete picture of James Morrison's wartime service and the respect he had earned among his fellow pilots. Each anecdote revealed another facet of his character and competence. "Jim had this ability to see the big picture during complex missions," recalled former B-24 pilot William Foster. While other escort pilots focused on their immediate area, Jim seemed to understand the entire tactical situation and position his flight accordingly. Former ground crew Chief Thomas Anderson remembered Kate's grandfather from a different perspective. "Captain Morrison understood aircraft maintenance as well as any pilot I ever worked with. He'd sit with us during engine changes, asking questions and learning about potential problems. That knowledge helped him get damaged aircraft home when other pilots might have bilayed out." As the evening progressed, Kate realized that her grandfather's reputation had been built on the same qualities George had been teaching her: complete understanding of aircraft systems, respect for the environment and conditions, and unwavering attention to detail. "George," she said as the banquet wound down, "I finally understand what you meant about aircraft understanding. My grandfather didn't just fly airplanes, he understood them completely. That understanding made him exceptional." "Exactly," George replied with obvious satisfaction. "And that same understanding is available to any pilot willing to invest the time and effort to acquire it. Modern technology makes flying easier, but it doesn't eliminate the need for fundamental knowledge." On Sunday morning, as they prepared for the flight back to Colorado, Kate felt like she was returning home as a different pilot than she had been just 3 days earlier. Her experience flying the P-51, combined with the stories she had heard about her grandfather, had given her new perspective on her own flying career. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said to George as they completed their pre-flight inspection. "This weekend has changed how I think about flying." "Thank you for being such an eager student," George replied. "Teaching you has reminded me why I love these old airplanes and the pilots who flew them." Margaret joined them at the aircraft, carrying the small overnight bag that had contained her supplies for the weekend. "Ready to go home?" she asked with a smile. "More than ready," Kate replied. "But I'm already planning my next visit to see George's workshop. I think I'd like to try building a scale model myself." "I was hoping you'd say that," George said with obvious pleasure. "I have the plans for your grandfather's specific P-51 at home. We could build an exact replica of Irish Eyes as a tribute to his service." Kate felt tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. The idea of building a scale model of her grandfather's aircraft with George's guidance represented the perfect culmination of everything she had learned about her family's aviation heritage. As they flew back across Kansas and Colorado, Kate reflected on how her casual comment about George understanding aircraft better than she could had led to the most meaningful educational experience of her flying career. But more than that, it had connected her to family history and aviation traditions that would influence her flying for the rest of her career. She understood now that truly exceptional pilots weren't just skilled operators. They were students of their craft who sought complete understanding of their aircraft and the environment in which they operated. That understanding, passed down through generations of aviators, represented the real legacy her grandfather had left her. George was right. Aircraft understanding was the foundation of exceptional flying, regardless of the technology involved. Kate was determined to continue building that understanding throughout her career, honoring both her grandfather's memory and the traditions he had helped establish. As they approached their home airport in Colorado, Kate realized that her journey of aviation discovery was just beginning. With George as her mentor and her grandfather's example as inspiration, she looked forward to decades of continued learning and growth as a professional pilot. The P-51 descended smoothly toward the familiar runway, carrying 3 passengers who shared a deep appreciation for aviation history and the timeless principles of exceptional flying. Kate's comment about George's aircraft knowledge had proven prophetic in ways she never could have imagined, opening doors to understanding that would influence her flying for the rest of her career.